I'm a fiction writer, which essentially means I make things up for a living. But in 2009, things weren't going so well for me. I hadn't published a book in years. The ones that had been published hadn't made any royalties and were out of print. I'd been working on a 200,000-word long novel set in Japan that I'd researched for 5 years, completely rewritten cover to cover twice, and had been rejected by every single publisher my US agent sent it to. At the time, I was also working as an adjunct creative writing professor, making $16,567 a year with zero health care and no benefits. I lived in downtown Los Angeles on 5th and Main, 2 blocks from Skid Row, in low-income housing, and I could literally look out my window and see where I'd end up if things didn't improve for me. That semester, I was tasked with teaching a course in oral storytelling, and immediately I thought, it has to be nonfiction. And the seed for that was planted by nearly 2 years of call me whenever you need me, frantic late-night phone calls with a very good friend of mine from college. He was an Army helicopter pilot, highly decorated in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was having some very serious problems with flashbacks. During our talks, he was able to put a few of those traumatic experiences into stories. And that was actually how I learned that stories can be not just a way of connecting with people, but an opportunity to distance oneself from traumatic experiences. I thought those things were pretty darn worthy. So I set to teaching my course the 5 essentials of immersive storytelling, things that I absolutely knew worked in fiction, but would be applied to nonfiction. And those things are hooks. They grab our attention. The unexpected. It's quite simply the art of surprise. It unbalances your audience. It makes them wonder what's coming next. Cause and effect. A linked series of events, one thing happening after another, that creates a dynamic chain of occurrence. How did it feel? Explaining mentally, emotionally, physically how you feel in a given story helps your audience connect on a human level. And lastly, concrete, specific detail. It is the lifeblood of storytelling. It convinces us. Now, I should also probably tell you that none of those techniques mean anything without authenticity. And I actually learned that the hard way when I was sitting across from quite possibly the most dangerous man I've ever met in my life. He was a prominent former Latino gang member in South Central Los Angeles. He'd heard that I had been speaking to some other former gang members and that I was thinking about writing a book about the 1992 riots. And he summoned me. That was actually the word that was used, summoned. And it was his decision, ultimately, once he met with me, to see whether or not people would keep speaking to me. And I was told very straightforwardly, this is your only opportunity to speak to someone with some very real power. I was terrified, but not for myself. You see, the person who told me that I had to go to this meeting told me like this. He said, "Don't worry. If anything goes wrong, he'll get up, he'll walk away, you'll never see him again. Nothing will happen to you." But then he said something might happen to me. And that is one of the heaviest things I've ever experienced in my life. But it was also a turning point. Because you saw the numbers at the beginning of this talk. I was struggling for self-confidence then. And to have someone that I barely knew essentially put themselves on the line for me, showed me that I had something of worth. And I've built around that since. That's one of the reasons why I'm standing here right now. Now, as it happens, I should probably tell you this. There were rules for this meeting. 3 of them. Number 1, come alone. Yeah. Number 2, I could only ask questions when I was told I could. And lastly, when I spoke, I had to be 100% honest no matter what. And I was told that that would keep me safe. Now, I'd never been to Linwood alone before, and for those who don't know, Linwood is right next to Compton. I took the 760 bus south from downtown, and I was more than a little afraid of getting jumped. So I put my real phone in my right sock and a fake phone that didn't even work in my right pocket. I thought I was really, really smart. And when I got to this restaurant, I walked through the door. I was recognized immediately. That wasn't tough, by the way. I was the only white boy in the whole place. And there was a guy standing next to the door who just kind of nodded up at me, and I knew this was the person who would be guiding me. Of course, I was so incredibly nervous at this time. I was ready to just blurt everything. This is my name, and this is what I'm doing. And he just made it clear to me with a look that I didn't need to say anything right now. And he gestured for me to follow him as he walked through this crowded restaurant with this full dining area on a Wednesday night, Spanish bouncing off of every wall, couples and families having dinner. And as we walked through that, we entered an empty patch of floor that formed a moat around a single table in the back corner. I knew that's where we were sitting. And that's where he took me. He sat down, and once again, I'm ready to just tell him everything. And he puts his hand out like he wants me to put something in it. And he says, phone. Because now I have a decision to make. My real phone in my sock, or my fake one in my pocket? Well, I had to be 100% honest. And I figured that was part of it. So as I was reaching down and pulling the phone out of my sock, he was already laughing. He said, you know, that's the first place they'd look. And as I was trying to figure out how I felt about that, a man who was not the waiter came by and took my phone. And I watched it go. And every step he took, my stomach just got lower and lower and lower. Probably hit my ankles. Because that was my connection to the outside world. Those were all my contacts. My ability to call 911 if I needed to call 911. But by the time I looked back, the questions really started in earnest. Who was I? Where was I from? What did I do? What did I want? And as I'm answering each one of these as quickly and as honestly as I possibly can, I'm looking at him, and I'm seeing a rather particular disfigurement that could only have been done with a very long knife. And I know immediately that I have to tell him the story of what happened to me when I was 17. I just have to find the right moment. And I shouldn't have lost my train of thought, because that's when he really hit me. And he said, so you're a writer, but you haven't published anything in a really long time. You know, I had these amazing reasons for why that wasn't the case. You know, the economy was really bad at the time. The publishers were going through all manner of awfulness. They were merging. They were going out of business. Also, no one got what I was writing. And that hurt me the most. But I looked this man in the eyes and I just said, it wasn't good enough. And he caught that past tense. And he said, "So when did you let it go?" And I had to tell him. I said, "I was in Kansas. I was at my grandmother's house. I hadn't seen her in years. And during that time, I had this relentless positivity. I just kept telling myself, if I work harder, everything will be fine." So this woman who was sitting at this table in that chair, she turns to me and she's never asked anyone an empty question in her life. And she said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Fine." She looked right into me. She said, "You're not fine." And I swear, when she said that, something broke inside me. And when I told him that, he just nodded his head, like he understood how grandmothers could be all-knowing. And for just a moment, it was quiet. And I pounced on it because, yes, I was told I couldn't ask questions, but they didn't say I couldn't tell a story. So I said, when I was 17 years old, I was standing at the back of my high school student council class. I was standing next to an offensive lineman from the football team, aptly nicknamed Lump, who just so happened to be tripping on acid at the time. And to my left was my classmate Anne, whom I would much rather have been speaking to, and Lump says, "Hey, do you want to play fight?" I said no, and I turned, and I shouldn't have. I didn't feel his elbow hit me. I just saw a flash of black. Something popped inside my head. My ears rang, and I started walking on autopilot up the central aisle of the classroom. I looked down at my soccer jacket, which had a white triangle on it and explosive flecks of blood, and I just remember thinking, that's never coming out. That was my first experience with the banality of shock. How something so small and simple and everyday can seem important in a moment of emergency. I took one more step, and the blood came pouring out of my nose, just fountainous, at a pace I've not seen since, except in horror movies. And hours later, I was sitting in the office of a visiting Swedish surgeon, ear, nose, and throat, who was on a fellowship at Colorado College, and he was giddily telling me that my nose break was 1 in a million because the nasal bone hadn't actually fractured. The force of the elbow had hit me in such a way that it tore all the cartilage out of my nose and put it on the side of my face in a wide J. I had 2 facial reconstructive surgeries. They wanted to do a third, but I said no. I just couldn't take it anymore. It was about a year before I could properly smell and taste again. And when I told that to the man sitting across from me, moment by moment, I noticed his guard go down, and he pulled his chair up, and he leaned forward, and as soon as I was done, he asked questions about my treatment, my surgeries, my nerve damage, and I realized pointedly that I was speaking to someone who was fluent in pain. But I realized something else, and it was simply that my story had changed the space around us. It was no longer about how I looked or where I was from, or how he looked or where he was from. It was about being human together. It was about empathy. You could say it built a bridge. And believe it or not, this bridge actually stands to this day. He and I still talk. He still laughs when he tells me the story of meeting me and how he told some of his old homies that it was okay, they could talk to me. And even though I'd been researching prior to that moment, that night absolutely began my odyssey with all involved. Now, I know I was extremely preoccupied with numbers at the start of this talk, so I hope you can forgive me if I focus on just 2 more. In 2014, when my US agent took my novel to auction, no publishers said no. 0. I still don't know how I feel about that. But when it was published this year, it became my first book published in 10 years. And in some places, it was treated as a debut because I've been gone so long that people forgot about me. And yet, my book was the very first piece of writing where I very conscientiously made sure to put the 5 essentials of immersive storytelling in there every page, every paragraph, every sentence. Hooks, the unexpected, cause and effect, how did it feel, concrete specific detail. But again, none of this matters without authenticity. Authenticity is a magnet. It might seem small and simple, but it commands an invisible power. It determines whether or not your audience takes your story home with them and thinks about it. I did 2.5 years of research and background for all involved. I spoke to graffiti guys, firefighters, former gang members, nurses, California Highway Patrol officers, and more. It was an incredibly diverse group of people. I always told them my story. I was always honest with them. I carried that forward. And I realized something. Authenticity in practice is not invisible. It can be heard in your tone. It can be seen in your body language. It can be felt by your listener. Authenticity is basically a way of saying, I trust you to see who I truly am. And ironically, it was by doing that, opening myself up, that I learned how to see others better. It had a dramatic impact on my writing. My prose became more empathetic, more human, which is really all I ever could have asked for. Except maybe one thing. I don't live in that 215 square foot apartment anymore. I moved, and I moved on, but I still carry it with me, and I could tell you a story about it.